The latest energy production report for California is out, and the liberals are trying to spin it as a big success. But if you look carefully, you'll find it's actually confirming what we've said all along. California's experiment with the Green New Deal is a complete disaster. It's going to cost you a lot of money, and it's going to result in massive energy disruptions. Coming up, we'll talk to an expert who will lay all of the negative side effects out and tell you what we can do to try to fix the problem that the Green New Dealers have created in California. I'm Carl DeMaio, chairman of Reform California, and California liberal politicians have been actually implementing the Green New Deal for the past 10 years, actually, some would argue longer. And this is basically a monumental shift in our energy from basically an all of the above energy supply with carbon-based fuels and a mix of renewables to all 100% renewables, no carbon-based fuels. They're also implementing a number of other mandates, not just on energy source, but what appliances you can use, what sort of cars you can drive. All of this has led to a massive increase in costs, as well as very uncomfortable and inconvenient disruptions in businesses and our daily lives. This morning, the Union Tribune in San Diego published a story that's part of a narrative that we're seeing presented by the media, where they do not want to have any sort of negative information flow out on California's experimentation in the Green New Deal. Here's the headline. California's energy mix is changing, but natural gas is still the number one source. And you might, look at that and say, well, maybe they are starting to tell the truth. But they do a whole story on how California is seeing an increase in renewables, but natural gas is still the number one source. But there's a goal in place to get us 100% renewable by 2045. It says, quote, with policymakers looking to derive 100% of the state's electricity from carbon-free sources by 2045, the amount of renewable sources in California's power mix has grown dramatically in the past 10 years. And they go on to say that we're still relying on carbon-based fuels, but nothing in their story contains any sort of critical review of the Green New Deal. Nothing in their story actually has an opponent to this experiment laying out the warning signs that perhaps this 100% renewable standard is not at all possible, that there's no way that you could achieve it without pretty much bankrupting the middle class in California and significantly diminishing our quality of life and destroying jobs in the process. So this story goes on and on about solar and wind and hydroelectricity and mentions nuclear. I don't even know why it mentions coal, because we really don't even get much power at all from coal in California. But nothing here reflects any sort of criticism of the whole experiment. It just says, hey, here's kind of the progress we're making. Right now, we're still carbon dependent. Some would say, no blank, Sherlock. My next guest will lay out all of the reasons why switching to all renewables in California under the Green New Deal is an impossible burden, and how it's going to cost you a lot of money and disrupt our lives. Al Medioli has a several decades long career in utility oversight. He started his career in architecture and infrastructure, designing various projects in the US, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Caribbean. What I like about that is that he spent almost a decade actually inside infrastructure. So he knows from a practical standpoint what is possible, what's not possible with building infrastructure, with energy, with utilities. After that, he joined one of the big rating agencies, the ones that give credit scores to bonds and companies and governments. And he specialized for those rating agencies in analyzing risk and financial health of the energy sector and utilities, and of course, state and local governments. So he knows about how government policies, either are sustainable from a financial standpoint or are not. And he looks at the long-term operational risk of government policies and whether or not it's viable. So joining me is Al Medioli. He's now a senior fellow at the Transparency Foundation, and you can check out a lot of his work at thetransparencyfoundation.org, thetransparencyfoundation.org. Al, thanks for joining us. So in your decades of experience in looking at energy, utility companies, government policies in these sectors, you've become increasingly concerned about the Green New Deal movement, or what some in the corporate world call environment social governance. What are some of the concerns that you've had for the past 25 years about these proposals?
Thanks, Carl. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a complicated story. Mostly, it's complicated because people seem to have forgotten everything everything they ever learned in high school physics about how the real world works, right? And so the Green New Deal and then the whole notion that we can shift to renewable energy is really a series of interlocking false narratives. And I think probably the simplest way to express this is that we could be 100% reliable, 100% rely on renewables if somehow the sun would shine 24/7.
Not going to happen.
Alas,
not going to happen.
Yes, it doesn't. It only shines for 8 hours a day. And so, and I think in one of the essays that we did, we showed a graph of a typical day in
no. I'm gonna get to some of your essays. I've got some of the best hits that I'm gonna pull out for our viewers.
Yeah.
But basically, you came to the conclusion that this is not. There's no way that the Green New Deal, as currently proposed, there's no way that California, or by extension the United States, could possibly follow this path and lead to success.
Right. I mean, worldwide, there's been a tremendous amount of expenditure on renewable energies, particularly in the West, in the U.S. and Europe. Of course, China and India see right through this and are building. China has 1,100 coal plants right now, and is building more. The United States has, I think, 225. Right. So they understand that this is not going to work. I think after all these trillions of dollars of expenditure on renewable energy, we're still more than 80% reliable on fossil fuels because they really work. The energy is very dense, it's transportable, it's very, very efficient, right? And the whole notion that carbon dioxide, which is, I think, the fourth or fifth most common element in the entire universe, is somehow a poison, is ridiculous. The notion
I'm going to have you on a future episode to talk about the 5 problems with the climate change narrative. But let's get out first with on the Green New Deal. I think that there are really 3 things that we can identify where California is going to suffer. Right. Number one, we know that there's going to be a monumental increase in the cost of living, cost of electricity, cost of energy. We're already seeing that. Number 2, we're going to have massive disruptions, brownouts and blackouts. We've already been seeing that in the past 10 years. And then number 3, the thing that I love about your research and your work is that you've actually pointed out that the Green New Deal is actually not so green after all, that there are a tremendous number of negative environmental impacts if you actually follow their policies to conclusion. So let's start out with costs first. In the state of California, you were able to look at our energy rates, and there's a report that you authored on the energy rates. A new study exposes $4.5 billion in hidden state taxes on California utility bills, and climate mandates add even more. And this is just a summary of your report. And of course, our viewers can see the full report. And I really encourage you to read the full report. It is very eye-opening. It shows you where all the costs are coming from, all the climate change mandates. But the full report is online at thetransparencyfoundation.org. But you found that Californians last year were forced to pay 67.1% more for their electricity than the national average. and 30.1% more for natural gas than the national average. But that was just in 2022. As we got into 2023, and one of the reasons why you authored your report, there was a massive spike, a tripling in some bills and a doubling in most bills in the cost of natural gas. And you basically pinpointed that, yeah, the gas companies knew that this was going to happen. They raised their rates because government mandates, new Green New Deal mandates, are pushing them out of the natural gas industry, and they're trying to electrify everything. And so you look at the costs being, right now 2/3 higher. And one of the conclusions that you had in your report is that you're predicting that there could be easily a doubling in electricity rates in the next 5 years in the state of California. Why are why are these climate change mandates that push renewables? Why does that lead to exponentially more expensive energy costs for working families?
Well, what you're doing is you're doubling. Well, there's a couple of reasons, but you're adding basically a level of generation that doesn't really do very much good. So you're building. We're taking subsidies basically that are created. This stuff is all following subsidy. Without the subsidy from the infrastructure, the Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera, no one would bother to build any solar plant or any wind farm. When I was an investment banker, the only reason why we owned wind farms was because of the tax credit. So without the subsidy, this stuff doesn't make any sense because the existing system works quite well, right?
But it would be logical to critique the cost of the Green New Deal, as even though these California rates are 67% higher, and we expect they're going to double than the national average, that the true cost is actually much higher because a lot of the energy sources we're buying from are actually already subsidized out of the other side of our pocket in the form of our tax dollars are going to those projects to subsidize financially unsustainable energy production.
Yes, and I think we discovered when we unpacked the typical California utility bills that the state had basically essentially taken over all the utilities and was larding all kinds of non-energy programs into the energy bill. For example, managing the forests, which is not the utilities' responsibility. They have to manage the lines, but not the forests, right? And all kinds of programs to make higher energy bills affordable to poorer residents, when in fact you should be trying to lower the cost of power generally. It's as though governments are intentionally increasing the cost of power, right? And one of the other fallacies underlying this entire narrative that people don't seem to understand is that it's predicated on an electrification of everything, right? We're going to electrify everything. Well, guess what? Right now, and you've seen this chart, Carl, like we have it in one of our reports, about a third of all energy consumption in terms of calorie content, right, of all the energy goes into producing electricity for the grid. Only about 20% of that comes out as net usable energy because of line losses, because of inefficiencies in generation.
So you're talking about the generation losses, and that was remarkable in your report, where you basically pointed out because California's climate change mandates have reduced the production of power in California, we now have to import our electricity from neighboring states, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, and that in order for that power to get to us, they have to transport it. So if you produce 3 kilowatts in Nevada or Arizona or somewhere else, just to transport it to California, it takes 1 of the kilowatts away. And so you're left with a third reduction for transportation costs. So you have to buy 3 kilowatts of energy, but you're only going to be able to consume 2. I mean, when I was a kid growing up, the environmentalists used to teach us waste not, want not. It sounds very wasteful for us to basically constrict the production of power in California because we're trying to be virtuous or we're trying to pretend like we're renewable, when in fact we're buying carbon-based fuel from another state and shipping it and losing a third of the value of the energy. It's very wasteful.
Right, and efficiency, I think, is always, I would agree with your mother, for example, that waste not, want not. You always want to be efficient, and that's the sort of the first rule of guarding against pollution is to not to waste things. But that's why things like fossil fuels are so efficient. If you a lot of the fallacies, whether it's recycling or Green New Deal, it's a question of how you're doing the accounting, right? So, for example, if you take a recycling, the whole notion of recycling, and this is now another narrative. We know it doesn't really work very well. The best way to recycle is on the factory floor, because whether it's plastics or metals, it's in this pure state. You've made a mistake in the manufacturing. It hasn't been altered. You can use it for another product of the same type.
Right.
It's very, very costly to recycle once it gets into the waste stream, right? So it's a question of when you add up, all the costs of having multiple pickups in the town, multiple garbage trucks, your landfilling, your sorting, all that extra work, all of that stuff is an energy cost. And does recycling make sense? Probably not.
Right, and that's on the recycling mandates. I mean, most of these environmental mandates, they don't. I mean, it sounds good on paper. It sounds good at the press conference, but in terms of execution, and that's why I like the fact that you started your whole career in implementation of infrastructure. That the theory doesn't always translate into practice. Let me go into this CCA real quick. So you did a paper on something that is happening a lot in California. So California politicians want to basically take over our local utility. They want to have government be your utility company. And look, I'm not a big fan of corporations and utility companies, but I'm also not a big fan of government. So in California, they call it the community choice aggregation. You wrote a story called "What is a CCA and Why You Should Be Worried?" Again, this is also at thetransparencyfoundation.org. This is basically government taking over your utility service, but this government agency isn't producing energy, correct? They're buying the energy from the same utility company. They're just taking over reading meters, sending out bills, and
no, not even that. That's the irony. I first saw these actually. They came into one of the rating agencies, and the first question was, "What is it that these guys are doing?
What do they do? If this is an organization, a company, what product or service do they sell?"
Well, all they're doing. It's actually the CCA basically hires the existing utility. They don't have any bucket trucks. They don't have any electricians. They don't have any power plants. They hire the local utility to send the bills out, to maintain the lines, to provide the power, to basically do all the nuts and bolts work of the electric utility. What these CCAs do is they say, we're going to give you an option. You can buy 50% energy that's totally renewable and green, or 100%. They have different options. And really their job is, remember I talked about earlier about subsidies? Their job is to create a market for all the excess, for example, solar power that California produces in the middle of the day. California produces a huge surplus of solar power when the sun is shining that it can't use. And so basically the CCAs are buying the area under the curve and pretending that this is something that you can use in the evening. Of course you can't, because it doesn't exist in the evening. And all these big battery farms last maybe 3 hours, 3.5 hours.
Yeah, we're going to get into all that. Let's stick with the cost and what a CCA is doing.
The CCA, basically, it's a job creation program. They add about, as far as we could figure, about 10% of the cost. They do nothing. They add no value.
Well, let's look at that. So you did a case study on the East Bay Community Energy CCA. What's amazing here is you looked at their financials, you looked at their reports, and you found basically their admission that they do absolutely nothing. It says, quote, "A core function of EBCE, which is the government-run utility, is to provide electric service that includes the use of renewables. EBCE began its delivery operations in 2018. Electricity is acquired from the electricity suppliers, so they're not producing electricity, and delivered through existing physical infrastructure and equipment managed by Pacific Gas and Electric Company." So what the hell does the government do of value in this transaction? I mean, the answer is nothing, right?
Well, it makes you feel very good because it's telling you that you're buying 100% green energy, and you can feel very virtuous.
So you went on to, and I'm going to get to that graph in just a minute. You went on to look at their financials. East Bay Community Energy Authority statements of revenues and expenses. And here you've got electricity sales for this government enterprise, what they're charging the consumer. And here it's like $500 million. And then operating expenses are a little less than that. They had income of about 53 million in 2022. That's a big increase from 2021. Look at that profit hike. They had some grants that they got from government, which means it's coming from your other pocket. Made a little interest, lost a little money from financing expenses. But wait a minute here. What is their operating expenses? Well, they have the cost of electricity, which means they buy that from the utility company. The 16 million for contract services, which means they're hiring PG&E to do all the work. So am I to understand that the 7.8 million for staff compensation and the $2.7 million for general administration is basically the government's markup on these customers?
Yeah, I mean, if you took these guys away, it would not change the number of electrons delivered to the people buying this service.
And it wouldn't
Right?
change the cost of PG&E's contract services to do the work.
No, I mean, they're already doing it.
So we're basically paying what? Let's see, rough math, $11 million, higher rates, because government wants to basically be the middleman. Government bureaucracy wants to be the face of your utility company and subcontract to the private utility company. This is where these politicians say, let's get rid of those mean, profit-driven private utility companies. So what they do is they take the same product and they just simply put a new label on it and do a markup and they sell it to the consumer. Is that basically what a CCA is? Well, let's talk about that now. That's a nice segue. So we have the cost is going to be higher, and government wants to be the middleman to increase costs even more. So now let's talk about disruptions. The LA Times has this chart that they used just a couple months ago. It says here are our energy sources throughout the day. Renewables, obviously, when the sun is out. Natural gas dips down. Then there's imports, which is imports from other states. They don't really explain that we are so dependent on other states because we've constricted the production of power. And then a little bit there for hydro, which kind of goes throughout the day. What's not this is such a misleading graph because it makes you feel as though, wow, look at how much of renewables is doing. This is great. This whole experiment in Green New Deal works. What's interesting is this other graph. This is from the independent system operator. California electricity generation by fuel type. This tells the real story. That reddish big block in the middle there is natural gas, and solar is that yellow little tiny piece there. I mean, it's nice to have that extra money, that extra electricity, but no doubt natural gas is the biggie. A lot of that is from the imports. A lot of the imports also would add to the natural gas number here if you just did in-state plus imported electricity. But the graph that I want to share, and this is something that you've been putting into your materials, is this one. Uh, this was in your what is a CCA and why you should be worried. So you took this graph, and again, these are government data sets. This is from the state of California. This is state of California demand and power production, something that LA Times will not show you or any other media outlet, because they know as soon as you see this graph, you're going to realize, holy cow, this whole Green New Deal, all renewable program ain't ever going to happen. So this top one, this green line here, is total demand for electricity. No surprise, throughout the day, because there's 24 hours in a day. So here's hour 18. It's kind of when the sun goes down and people get home and they turn on their stove, or they start making food, and they turn on the lights, they start watching TV. So demand is pretty high there. This other little increase over here is when people get up in the morning, make breakfast, turn on the morning news.
Put down the toaster. Yeah.
Exactly. And so total demand kind of goes like this, and that's just kind of sunk. Solar and wind never actually meets demand, ever, on any part of the graph. And then down here is, take a look. Here's the height. At the very best part of the day, with the most electricity being generated by solar, the solar generation is way, way below total demand. There's this massive gulf here. So even during the heyday period of the solar generation, they're not even coming close to meeting demand. We have to have those carbon-based fuels. And in the evenings, you're screwed because lights out. It is absolutely not going to produce energy from the solar. No one in the media is sharing this graph and asking the question of our elected officials, how are you going to bridge the gap? So is it possible to bridge the gap? They say they're going to do it through batteries, Al. Is it possible to go all hydro, all solar, all wind, and not have disruptions if we rely on batteries?
Well, batteries don't generate electricity, right? All they do is store electricity. And again, we're now at the point where we're very, very expensive. We can maybe do 3 or 4 hours with these large battery arrays. But, up until even a few years ago, these big Tesla batteries only lasted about an hour, right? So the point is that, and this is an example of a shoulder month. It's not particularly, there's not a lot of energy demand, because it's not in the summertime the high air conditioning nor the high winter demand, right? So it's a very moderate, what we call a shoulder month in the utility business. To basically have enough, if you had perfect battery storage, right? Which means your batteries would have to last for a week or more, because what if you have a string of rainy days, right? Or windless days, right? You would have to have 4 or 5, maybe 6 times the amount of generation in solar power and wind power to supply those batteries. Beyond that, that assumes that all of the energy supplied for all purposes comes through the electric grid, which is, we're nowhere near that right now. The electric grid, of course, as we saw in Maui, needs to be updated, because a lot of it's really old, right? But most energy is not consumed in terms of electricity. It's consumed directly. So, for example, when the government says, oh, everybody should have an electric car, well, the first question is, well, where's the power coming from? If you're telling me we're going to have electric cars by 2030, shouldn't we be building, 16 nuclear plants right now?
And
right?
California is about to shut its last nuclear plant at Diablo
Right.
Canyon.
So none of this makes so little sense that you have to wonder what's the real motive.
Well, what is going to happen because this is a current chart of demand. What happens when we go and implement an all electric vehicle fleet? Because that's the mandate, get rid of all gas powered cars. So we have to switch from gas powered cars to electricity. We have to get rid of our gas stoves, our gas water heaters, our gas heaters in our homes. Mm-hmm. What happens when we shift all those appliances and all those vehicles over to electricity? Demand goes up by what?
Well, I mean, at least I would think at least probably more than a third. But right now, when you think that the electric grid net consumes between, consumes about a third of generation and only supplies a 20% of net production, we're talking about multiple increases here. I mean, can you imagine? Are we going to run jet airplanes on with electricity on batteries?
Not John Kerry's jet airplane. No, he'll be still
Right.
using carbon-based
I
fuels
mean,
for
I
his
mean,
private jet.
think about how much the world relies on diesel fuel, construction equipment, freighters. How is that going to be replaced?
And the impact to demand. So let's go to the last item, which is assuming their nirvana is actually implemented. First, we can't afford it. The massive increase in electricity costs that we've seen, it's only going to get worse. The disruptions, the brownouts and blackouts, if we can't meet supply and demand here. But there are environmental side effects to these Green New Deal energy sources. You got this story that I thought was pretty provocative. Will solar farms cause another Dust Bowl? And you basically harken back to the 1930s Dust Bowl, which most of us weren't alive for that. So tell us what you're seeing in the terms of the connection potentially to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s and these solar farms today.
Well, this is triggered by a couple of articles where environmentalists are very concerned by the fact that we're building all of these these huge arrays, thousands and thousands of acres of solar arrays in very marginal semi-arid land, and you're covering up the land, right? You're basically destroying the vegetation and the life, underneath. And these are pretty fragile ecosystems, right? And this is being done willy-nilly because people are pursuing the subsidies, right? Lots of foreign firms are coming in, doing this. And I'm not saying that there isn't a place for this. I think in this, topic, we note that, for example, the Israelis have figured out a way to use solar panels to modulate the heat in fish farms in the desert, which is necessary, right? But when you start doing this, it begins to remind you of what happened in the 1920s, in the teens, when the economics of World War I, it was, a lot of huge demand for wheat. Europe was not producing food, caused a lot of marginal land in the Southwest, all across the Southwest, to be put under the plow, even though it was extremely marginal and extremely arid. And then, of course, we had a series of very, very high droughts, very, very hot weather in the 1930s, by the way, well before the advent of global warming. And it caused a relatively small section of this huge amount of area that had been plowed over to create these big dust storms. Because you
had this disruption of food in Europe, so that meant that U.S. land seemed more valuable to do food production, but the land was not the best and well suited for food production. It was pretty arid. You mentioned a bunch of speculators came in, bought up a bunch of land.
Suitcase farmers was the term at the time.
It was called what?
Suitcase farmers.
Suitcase farmers. So they saw speculation.
Yes.
To go in real quick, plow a couple years of land, produce a little food, and then what happened was they abandoned
when the prices collapsed. They disappeared. So these weren't farmers that were, interested in husbanding the land. They departed. The economics were gone, and so this land that had been protected by very thick sod for eons and eons was suddenly exposed. And when we had a series of very hot, dry spells, it was very prone to erosion.
So basically, the speculators came in, plowed the land, created the soil. Therefore, was all disrupted and dusty. We then had a heat wave because it comes and goes. And what was amazing about it is that the heat wave index chart that you have in your story from the US EPA, by the way, so these are US EPA numbers, shows how many extreme heat events there were in the United States. Look at this. Pretty much ups and downs, cyclically, but during the 1930s, this massive spike, all because of what? The speculators were out there disrupting the land, and all those particles got into the air and heated up. I know that in the desert, a lot of the times the temperature gauges are not as accurate because the sand gets hot and starts flying around in the windstorms, and that can affect the temperature readings, and they have to offset for that to get an accurate number. Um, are you concerned potentially that with all these solar farms that they're putting these panels out in the desert, they're disrupting all this land? Are you concerned that that could actually produce more environmental negative and more
Oh
negative
yeah,
environmental
yeah.
impacts like the Dust Bowl?
Yeah, am I predicting a dust bowl at a date certain? No, but the point is, no one is this when something or change happens this rapidly, for all the environmental, sort of do-goodism supposedly behind the Green New Deal, no one is concerned with the fragility of these landscapes, of these very fragile landscapes, and we're doing it for the wrong reasons. We're doing it out of basically out of greed, and people chasing subsidies, and there's no thought to the
Don't
impact.
solar panels have to be recycled at some point? Aren't we getting to
Right,
that
they
point
last
where
about.
we're entering the first generation of solar panels, which is 25, 30 years,
Yeah.
um, that we're going to have to find landfills to recycle or dispose of all the solar panels? We've got the wind turbines that are
Same
killing
thing.
birds. We've got whales off the coast of New Jersey, where I know you live, where they're having major marine habitat challenges. And then finally, all these people saying, hey, we're going to solve that previous problem of energy disruptions by having all these batteries. Um, isn't making a battery intense mining? You have to mine cobalt, you have to mine copper, all these commodities that you have to mine in order to make all these batteries and all these systems. And yet, aren't the environmentalists the first to oppose the opening of a mine, saying that it has all sorts of problems for particulate matter impacts in the air and water quality impacts in the water table?
And mining, unless you're using child slave labor in Africa, which is often the case for some of these
Which is
mines,
often the case
unfortunately,
even
right?
now, but go ahead.
Right. You're using a lot of diesel fuel.
Yes.
You can't mine without using fossil fuels. Yeah, and this goes back to the issue about how no one ever wants to do the proper, soup to nuts accounting, right?
No.
So
Well, no one wants to do the accounting because we have a corrupt liberal media that doesn't ask the questions.
right.
Okay, here's your nice, warm, and fuzzy sounding proposal of all solar and all renewable, and we're virtuous and we're better for the planet. Walk us through the full life cycle, every environmental impact, every cost, every disruption to our life, and then let's present that to vet your proposal. It's called cost benefit analysis. I don't just blame the idiots who are proposing this snake oil. I blame the liberal media for not asking the basic questions to protect consumers and
Right.
taxpayers.
And you can know that 20 years from now, the US taxpayer is going to be asked to fund, you know, windmill remediation programs, right? To take down
Yeah.
these ever increasing taller and taller. I mean, how do you when you and I've been on top of windmills, right? We've done a lot of we bought farms. I've done a lot of the physical investigation and due diligencing. When something goes wrong with a windmill that's 300 feet in the air, you have to bring out a crawler crane to repair it. How are you going to do that off the coast of New Jersey? These things keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
So all this stuff is going to have to be remediated at some point, and it's just a huge waste of money.
And I'll tell you right now, you're going to have companies that go bankrupt and just simply walk away.
Of course,
And then it
of course.
becomes the taxpayer's problem. And then, of course, those liberals that sold us the bill of goods, they're not going to be the ones to say, oops, sorry, this was my fault. They'll say, oh, I can't believe greedy corporate America did this, left this mess behind. And wow, hire me and I'll fix the problem. Well, you'll fix the problem that you helped create. Al, we're out of time. I really appreciate your data-rich presentation of the risks, the costs, the disruptions associated with the Green New Deal and what California is already experiencing. And if you don't live in California, I guarantee you need to watch what's going on out here, because it's only a warning of what will happen to you. You can get more information on Al's work at thetransparencyfoundation.org, thetransparencyfoundation.org. And of course, help us fight these liberal policies at reformcalifornia.org, where we have campaigns underway to stop the implementation of these costly and disruptive Green New Deal mandates. Until next time, this is Carl DeMaio with Reform California. Thanks for watching. Help us break through the censorship of the liberal media by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and subscribe to my YouTube channel.